Hello and welcome to this Experimentus presentation. Experimentus are a leading authority in software quality and testing. Many of our clients have asked us recently for guidance on GDPR, hence the reason for this presentation, what GDPR means to the test community. The internet is flooded with GDPR material from minute legal detail to generic key steps towards compliance. This presentation aims to highlight the significant points that test organisations and test community at large must understand and embrace. We will cover what GDPR is, how GDPR will impact organisations, key considerations for the test community, some environmental issues, test data and configuration impacts, testing within the GDPR framework, and data management. GDPR is the new EU General Data Protection Regulation. It is the same set of rules for the EU countries and for the UK. In the UK, it will replace the UK Data Protection Act, and it's here now. It will be fully enforced from the 25th of May 2018. The ICO will regulate GDPR in the UK. There are similar regulatory bodies in all the EU countries. There is a common misconception around Brexit and GDPR. Brexit will have no impact on GDPR. The UK government is already signed up to GDPR and is covered to the same degree as the EU countries. GDPR is not limited to EU citizens but covers personal data for anyone residing in the EU. Any organisation anywhere in the world controlling or processing EU-based personal and identifiable information must be GDPR compliant. Data controllers and processors are responsible for the compliance of any third parties they use to process personal data. Privacy must be designed into new systems and added into existing systems. Data subjects' consent to use personal data has been required for many years but has now become far more stringent. Consent for each use or processing of personal data must be individually, explicitly and clearly sought. The default must now be opt-out and not, as was common, opt-in. Retention policies must be indicated with the consent request. More on this in later slides. The data subject or person's rights are increased and must be available free of charge, simply and without undue delay. There will be massive increases in penalties. The ICO have indicated they are adopting a stringent approach. The expectation is they will be looking for some early big scalps. The first question for the testing community should be, does the system or manual process within the business model access EU-based personal identifiable information? The test organisation, department, team or person is generally responsible, even if not accountable, for the last validation point before live operation, and often has the blame aimed for failures in live. GDPR brings the potential for product risk beyond the scope of usual risk considerations. The test community should take on GDPR risk assessment tasks while they are gradually absorbed into the design, development and delivery culture. Even if GDPR has been embraced from the outset of a project, then testing will still have to validate it. Test processes must be updated to cover GDPR compliance validation now. GDPR should have a specific test type built into both functional and non-functional test levels. For example, just as accessibility testing has evolved into a commonplace test type. Obviously, security testing will remain extremely important, and testing will have to ensure the requirements are up to GDPR standards, and budgets may have to be expanded to cover this. Public bodies and organisations using personal data as part of their core business are mandated by GDPR to appoint a Data Protection Officer, DPO. The DPO must have direct access to the organisation board. Even organisations not covered by the DPO mandate should have a data privacy authority role or responsibility. If test management is to formally or even informally take on GDPR validation, then they do need direct access to the data authority, that is, the accountable role. Logically then, it would be beneficial to include the data authority in the races for significant stage gates. Data privacy impact assessments, DPIA, or a GDP mandate, and the outcomes should become a natural aspect of test analysis. Even if DPIA is conducted as it should be during requirements definition, then test analysis and design must aim to validate this. Environments. They've long been a source of anguish for the testing community. Think of availability, accuracy, performance. I'm sure the list could go on and on. They have often been a weak point in the data privacy and protection domain. Have you ever found data from an earlier test project in an environment that you're about to use? This has to change. For GDPR, we have to demonstrate and ultimately prove compliance. Audit trails of data migration journeys through test environments, pre-production and ultimately production, and all updates and changes along the way must be maintained. The audits must show that privacy was maintained along the journey and that redundant environments were adequately cleansed of migrated data. Environment management tools and utilities are also subject to audit. GDPR requires that, as much as possible, state-of-the-art facilities are employed in the management and security of environments. So again, audit trails will be required. Physical privacy protection of the environments must be as up-to-date and rigorous as practically possible. All of this naturally leads to definition and enactment of decommissioning strategies. Test data has always carried a high risk potential. This is even more significant for GDPR. Test data must be handled with the same privacy criteria as live data if it contains any EU-based personal data. Simple anonymisation or masking may not be sufficient for this. We understand there are occasions when live data has to be copied and used at some point, but this really should be made impossible to identify personal data from. Otherwise, data subjects' rights may come into play and consent will have to be sought to use their details for testing. Decommissioning is still a much abused activity in the test industry. This will have to change for GDPR. Again, has anyone ever found identifiable data from a previous project in their test environment? Configuration management is a feature of the larger picture of privacy and control, and configuration audits will increase in importance when breach investigation is necessary. Data and configuration are not essentially the responsibility of the test community, but we should understand the significance for GDPR and encourage their inclusion in stage gate entry and exit criteria. All systems and processes subject to GDPR should address the following: data mapping, knowing where the data is and what the relationships are. A common understanding is that it only takes 3 items of personal data to identify someone. Data flow, the movement, interfaces and processing of data. Data life histories, how and when data is created, read, updated, archived, restored and deleted. Systems should collect minimum possible data and retain only as long as it is required. Testing must cover the data subject rights, essentially consent, portability and erasure mechanisms. Data subject rights is a huge area of GDPR. There must be effective mechanisms for these rights to be enabled. They must cover verify and update and withdraw of any or all consent. Erasure is the complete and demonstrable removal of data. There are some caveats here. For example, legitimate interest. A supplier must retain a name and address in order to honour a warranty. Portability is the removal of data in a means that can easily be transferred to another controller. Personal data archives and their store and restore mechanisms must also be GDPR compliant. Privacy by design is not a testing responsibility, but it must be a significant review criteria for the test community, especially in the early requirements and design reviews. Also, the Data Privacy Impact Assessment, DPIA, is not a testing responsibility, but it is a GDPR mandate. Logically, it will be a significant component of risk analysis and management, so that mitigations can be designed in and validated by testing. Again, these are not test responsibilities, but they should at least be considered in test analysis and design. Personal data management must encompass the data and its metadata. Data audits and inventories were referenced in earlier slides. It is important that these are managed along with the data. Definitions and records of data sharing must also be available. Encryption, pseudonymization and masking must be defined and the use of those recorded. Enabling data portability may be considered as a component of data management. The regulator, the ICO in the UK, will be more amenable during an investigation, audit or inspection if secure data management mechanisms are in place. At some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, these mechanisms will need to be tested. The products that these mechanisms produce and manage will also need to be validated. Implementation of data management facilities is not a test responsibility, but validating them is. Inevitably, responsibility for validation of GDPR compliance measures will fall to the test community. GDPR compliance is on the organisation, not on testing. We will have to be proactive in our approach to GDPR changes. The test community are responsible for validating systems and processes accessing personal identifiable information. The test community must have direct access to the organisation's data protection authority. Like it or not, reliance on testing increases with the introduction of GDPR, at least until the whole organisation assimilates the GDPR understanding and culture. Experimentus can help you. As a first step, take a look at our GDPR survey. Our GDPR survey and feedback are proving very popular with many organisations across the world. It is a brief survey, but the questions are crafted to gain key indications using simple response selections. The feedback report is a very good first indication of your organisation's GDPR health. Thank you, and please contact us if you have any questions at all. Goodbye.